Ymedia.
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 Stay tuned with Ymedia.
Ymedia is a media company. With 360-degree approach in reaching the audience over 8 media platforms. Television, Channel Y Canada, 24/7, available nationwide.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Rona Singh and it's good to be here with you. There's lots to talk about today. Of course, Canadians and Americans have been eyeing this deadline date. Well, today came August 19th, the 50% tariff on Canadian goods. Well, President Trump says that he's going to delay it by 50%, the 50% Canada tariffs until August 22nd as talks continue. So we're going to let you know the latest. And there is a poll on how Canadians feel about this 50% tariff. We're going to cover all that and much more on the newsroom today. So now hearing from our Prime Minister, essentially the whole country has been eyeing what Prime Minister Mark Carney as his defining moment. What was he going to do on today's deadline, which would essentially impose 50% tariffs on Canadian goods that would essentially impact about $20 billion on Canadian goods. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney says that Canada and the United States have made substantial progress, so very careful in his terms, and essentially saying that there was an intensive trade negotiations after President Trump proposed the new 50% tariffs on approximately $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. Now, the tariffs were scheduled to take effect at 12:01 a.m. on August 19th, but they have been delayed until 12:01 a.m. on August 22nd. So now we still have officials that are still finalizing the document. And President Trump declared that the two countries have, in his terms, in quotes, have made a deal. But Prime Minister Mark Carney was more cautious, saying that important work remains before an agreement is complete. So it seems like it was very optimistic from the American perspective, and from the Canadian side. Well, I think Prime Minister Mark Carney has now had enough experience with President Trump to know that if he says one thing, things could change very fast. And so until, it's signed and the ink has dried on paper, but, we saw what took place with the MOU and between the United States and Iran. Well, mind you, this is a different situation, but nevertheless, it is important to be cautious. So now this proposed agreement is expected to address a few things that the Americans said that they have issues with, contentious issues when it comes to Canadian policies. One being that Americans want to have access to the Canadian markets, more specifically when it comes to dairy and the alcohol restrictions. They want it removed. Essentially, if you recall, earlier on this year, American alcohol was removed from the shelves in Ontario, the LCBO, and in other countries, and in other provinces. It was regulated by the province, essentially removing American alcohol, as part of the response back to all the tariffs President Trump has placed on Canada. And then the other contentious issue is automotive trade, as well as economic security commitments, as well as some things here about digital trade rules. Now, neither government has publicly released the full terms. So this is the stuff that we're hearing from the negotiators, and so very little. And what's on the table, of course, will be really revealed when the agreement is signed. And that's a big thing in terms of this defining moment for Prime Minister Mark Carney, is that if he does make the concessions that President Trump wants, perhaps Canadians won't be happy with him. And if he doesn't, then you're in a situation where you could face the 50% tariffs, which will immediately impact the Canadian economy. And of course, the concessions will also impact whether it's the auto industry as well as the dairy industry. Now, President Trump formally postponed the tariffs for this 3 days, and the tariffs would have imposed an additional 50% duty on roughly $20 billion of Canadian imports going into the United States. And it covered products including Canadian wine, dairy-related goods, vehicle, hockey sticks, and cement and other products. Now, the duties would even apply to covered Canadian goods that qualify for the preferential treatment under CUSMA. So CUSMA is the trilateral trade between Canada, United States, and Mexico. And essentially, this new 50% tariff would be able to apply on goods that were previously covered under CUSMA. So now when it comes to energy, potash, critical minerals, as well as fish and products already subject to the US Section 232 tariffs are among the exemptions. Now, President Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke on Tuesday afternoon, so prior to the deadline, and that was their second conversation in the week. So if you believe, the week starts, and then you have potentially a conversation on Monday, but definitely it's been said that they had a conversation yesterday prior to the deadline. And now there are senior negotiators still continuing their talks in Washington. And President Mark Carney has said that there's substantial progress that have been achieved. So that's quite critical. But he did warn that the important work still remains. So now this is a time where you have President Trump said that the delay was granted because Canada and the United States have a deal, right? So that's a bit of a distinction between what the American president saying versus the Canadian Prime Minister. But the president did say that the deal is subject to a finalization of the documents. Now, the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, as well as said that the emerging agreement would include a few things, such as the broader access to American goods, as well as economic security commitments between Canada and the United States, and the digital trade alignment. So now measures also involve the dairy, which we've heard about in the news reports, as well as alcohol. Those things were mentioned when it comes to dairy, alcohol, and the motor vehicles. The other additional stuff is to be seen of what the concessions are and what the agreements will be. Now, the White House says that Canada has committed to addressing U.S. complaints concerning American alcohol, cheese, and automotive exports. Now, Ottawa has not publicly confirmed the precise concessions that it will make. And we have the Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Chief Negotiator Janice Charest. They have been in Washington for negotiations with Greer as well as the U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. And we've known that we've announced that they've been in Washington almost every day and throughout the weekend going over some of the items that are on the table in terms of what the Americans have an issue with. Now, when it comes to discussions, well, they reportedly include reducing the existing U.S. automotive tariffs from 25% down to 15%. And this is with a possible further reduction based on vehicles that are American content. Now, when it comes to the manufacturing side and the automotive industry, it's a very connected supply chain between Canada, United States, and Mexico. A part can cross the border multiple times before a vehicle is put together. So therefore, there is a significant distinction when it comes to American content versus Canadian or Mexican. Now, Canada wants all North American content, including Canadian and Mexican contents, to count towards tariff reductions. And that is a massive issue right there. We know that when it comes to the manufacturing plants, essentially there's not that much margin. So if you're adding 25% or even this 15%, that is a significant amount. And this is a time where we have a lot of the automotive plants actually weighing their concerns about if they're even able to open up the plants, if these tariffs do get added, or if concessions are made from Ottawa, and how that will impact the industry as a whole. And then, of course, there's a domino effect, right? So if a manufacturing plant has to shut down or reduce its number of employees because it just doesn't make sense to be able to manage the overhead with the tariffs or the concessions that may have a reduced tariff amount, and then that's quite critical in terms of these plants staying open, and then the communities that are supported by workers that work at these automotive plants. So it definitely has a domino effect right there. But Here you have a case where Washington has pushed to only count only for US made components. And this is something that President Trump has said that he wants to make sure that the number increases, the percentage of US American content of automotive industry. Now, automotive products. Now, we know that previously President Trump has said that, he doesn't need Canada to make American cars, and he's said a lot of different things. And so it's a time where Canadians have very little trust to what this Trump administration may do. And for that reason, everything he says is very critical to what the bottom line will be. And you know what? Markets do react to it as well. So now, the other thing President Trump also suggested, but of course, we don't know if it's part of the agreements, is that he suggested the abandoned Keystone XL pipeline. If you recall that, that was something that he had approved in his first term that was essentially canceled by President Joe Biden as soon as he got into office. Essentially, President Trump said that it could be revived. And although there's no proposal or timeline announced, so we know he says a lot of different things, but then there is looking at our Canadian officials, our prime minister and the trade minister to know, is this going to be part of the greater agreement? Now, the White House says that the Canadian imports of US motor vehicles did decline approximately 22%, or what that would be in dollar figure is $5.6 billion between April of 2025 and March of 2026, compared to the corresponding 2024 and 2025 period. So immediately it was noticed that there was a decline, right? And that's not a surprise, from Canada being the 51st state, and the tariffs and all of that really changed the mood of Canadians, even traveling to the United States. So now also Canadian imports of American alcohol beverages also declined by approximately 81%. So that's a very significant amount. That equals to $582 million between the periods of March 2025 and February of 2026. So these figures were presented by the US administration to essentially say that because when it comes to alcohol contents being reduced by 81%, or when it comes to motor vehicle imports declining by 22%, is the reason of the tariffs. And the tariff is to essentially punish Canada for having policies that would prevent American products coming in. So that was part of what the White House essentially said is why President Trump invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act, going back to, it's an act from 1930, which is rarely used. But this also, it's a provision that allows the president of the United States to impose duties up to 50%. So he's going to the high end of the 50% when another country is essentially proceeds or deems to discriminate against American commerce. And so those are the criteria used based on those stats. Now, not looking at previously the contentious issues on tariffs prior to what actually caused it. Now, Canada maintains that there's several earlier US tariffs that violated CUSMA, and Canadian countermeasures were legitimate responses. And so now Ottawa has been seeking a broader agreement covering automobiles, steel, aluminum, and forestry, rather than this narrow settlement that's limited to just individual products, whether it be US alcohol or Canadian dairy, and etc. Now, this 3 days that are extension is very economically important because it should not be described as a complete trade agreement, because President Trump publicly did declare a victory, while you have Canadian Prime Minister Carney essentially really being careful and being very deliberate on the words that he used with his guarded language, that there is definitely a difference, suggesting that there's significant details that still remain unresolved, and perhaps it can be resolved over the next 3 days. So now for Canada, the central question is not simply whether Ottawa can prevent this latest round of tariffs. It essentially comes down to what concessions Canada may be expected to make on when it comes to dairy industry, when it comes to the provincial alcohol policies, as well as the automotive trade and digital regulations. So now this is important to see what Washington will deem to be very meaningful relief from this existing tariffs that of the 50% that they say that they want to place on Canadian industries. And in this case, saying it as if it's strategic, but it'll be very important to see how it comes out. Now, this is still a close deadline. 3 days is still a very short period of time. But of course, when it comes to businesses that have avoided this immediate tariff shock, essentially all of us waiting to see what would happen today, it is quite a relief to know that there's still a few more days, and there seems to be a positive note from the president of the United States. Meanwhile, we're also very carefully hanging on every word of Prime Minister Mark Carney. So that's very critical. Now, there is a poll. We're going to take a break. We'll come back, and I'm going to tell you what this latest poll is revealing how Canadians feel about this 50% tariff. We'll be right back.